Cheers, Sam. It's true to say that our clothes communicate something. So if I was to walk in here this morning and I was dressed in black suit, white shirt, black tie, without even speaking, what would I be communicating? Going to a funeral. I'm grieving. If I was to walk in wearing a Rangers shirt, without even communicating, what am I saying? I need psychological assessment. I'm mental, right? If I was to walk in this morning wearing a kilt, without even speaking, what would I be communicating? Welsh. Scottish, maybe a wedding. You could tell my clan by my tartan. The point is, our clothes communicate. And it doesn't matter if you're wearing a Burberry chav kind of cap, yellow cords and tweed jacket from the New Town, a scrubs wearing nurse, a burn your bra feminist, an all black wearing goth, or a no clothes nudist. Your clothes or lack of them communicate something about you. True? So what you picked out of your wardrobe this morning has communicated something else to everyone in the room. Even if by the choice of what you wear, you are saying, I don't care. You are communicating. Now, as we're going to read through 1 Corinthians 11, you can read it and just obsess about what men or women should or should not be wearing. But that is to miss the main point. The issue is not so much whether a man or woman is wearing a hat. The issue is what they are saying by that. All right? It's not so much the accessories that Paul is concerned about, in as much as those accessories expose their attitude. Now, we've been reading through 1 Corinthians, and Paul has exposed the attitude of this Corinthian church time and time and time again. 4 times he has quoted them by saying this: I have the right to do anything. 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 Twice in chapter 6, twice in chapter 10. And we've seen the impact that that attitude has had on sex and on eating food sacrificed to idols. Today, Paul is going to show how that attitude, saying, I have the right to do anything, is impacting the relationships between men and women in this church. So let's read from verse 2. We'll go down to verse 6 just now. Paul says, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved. Then she should cover her head. What? Here's the first thing I want to show you to try and make this point. Verse 2 to 6 are about living with another head. The Corinthian attitude we've seen is, I have the attitude, I have the right to do anything. Now, you could express that sentiment by saying, I am my own head. All right? Now, head can sometimes just mean like literal head, but even we use head for different things. So we might use head for the head of a river, we might use it for the head of state, we might use it for a head teacher. And so when we have that attitude, I have the right to do anything, I am my own head, we're saying this: I am my own head teacher, I'm the head of my own wee state, I am the source of my river, I am my own head. Do you get the point? Now look what he says in verse 3. He says first, the head of every man is Christ. Now, as I understand it, that statement is true of every Christian, regardless of whether you are male or female. Jesus is your head. He is the source of your eternal life. He is your representative in heaven. He is the one who is your authority on everything. The Christian life is one that you live with another head. When I was head of my own life, that became the source of my sin. And my sin then represented me before God. And so as a head teacher, he ought to punish me. And yet Jesus comes and he did not lord it over me by beating me into submission. He didn't drive me like a slave with a whip. He didn't exploit me on the basis of his own rights. What did he do? We're told in 1 Corinthians, he gives up his rights. And for a rebel like me, he displayed his strength by becoming weak, and he displayed his wisdom by becoming foolish as he descended to death on a cross. For me, he becomes low. For me, he becomes despised. For me, he becomes nothing. To use the language of chapter 10 that we saw last week, he does not seek his own good, but the good of others, that many might be saved. Which means if you're a Christian, you have another head. Jesus is your head. He is your Lord. That word Lord, remember, is used 66 times in the book of 1 Corinthians. That's trying to make a point. If you're a Christian, if you're a member of the church, there's 66 reminders in this little letter that our life is not just with Jesus as our Savior, but living our lives under the authority of Jesus as our head. You have another head. Does that make sense? Now let's keep going in verse 3, because he says after that, the head of every man is Christ. Verse 3, and the head of the woman is man. Some translations, if you're reading the ESV, will say the head of every wife is her husband. Now, I get this is controversial. And it was no less controversial when Paul wrote it to the Corinthians, which is why we need to get clear on what he's saying and then wrestle with it. He says, if you're a Christian woman, first and foremost, Jesus is your head. But at this point, the wives in the Corinthian church need to hear that they also have another head, their husband. Now, we squirm at this, because instantly when we hear this, we go to the kind of power-hungry bloke who uses this kind of stuff to abuse their wife, cheat on their wife, dominate their wife by playing on this supposed inequality. And in our minds, we go straight to the bloke sat in his pants on a sofa, barking at his poor wife, demanding the dinner pronto and perfect. Now, you might not go there in your head, but I do. Now, if that is you, please, please listen. That is not a legitimate understanding of 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3. Look at the example before. What does it look like for Jesus to become our head? He becomes low. He becomes nothing. He's willing to be despised. He does not seek his own good, but he seeks the good of many so that many might be saved. So what does it mean for a husband to be the head of his wife? It means he will follow the example of Jesus. He just said that, chapter 11, verse 1, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Blokes, if your headship in your marriage doesn't look like the headship of Jesus, then you are dishonoring Jesus as your head. If it does not look like seeking the good of your wife above your own good, it is not Christian headship. You get that, men? Now remember, Paul is aiming at their attitudes. And if we're honest, male and female probably go different ways in this. Men, we can go towards arrogant maleness. And women, we can go to a kind of defiant femaleness. And that's because we read this and we presume, mistakenly, that Paul here means inequality. Men are superior, women are inferior. Now, I'm going to show you why that is 100% mistaken by what Paul says next. He says in verse 3, after that, the head of Christ is God. Now, what is the relationship between God the Son and God the Father? They are absolutely, eternally, perfectly equal in godness. Both fully God. And yet there is a difference in their personhoods and in their roles. Listen to this carefully. The Father is everything that the Son is, except he is not the Son. And the Son is everything the Father is, except he is not the Father. Which means they are completely equal, yet different persons with different roles. The Father is the head of the Son, which means the Father loves the Son, which means the Father sends the Son, which means the Son prays things like, not my will, but your will be done. Jesus lived with another head, which means this is not an issue of inequality. There is a perfect unity in the Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit, in terms of who they are. There's difference in terms of what they do. You got a question, bud?
You say the Father is everything the Son is, but the Son is...
Except the Son. He's not the Son.
Except the Son.
Good question. Now, to clarify these things, let me give you a couple of important implications. Number one, like the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, the relationship between men and women is one of equality, but difference. So there is complete and absolute equality of being between men and female, but there is also fundamental and essential difference. Let me use that same phrase. A man is everything a woman is, except he is not a woman. And a woman is everything a man is, except she is not a man. Men, husbands, have God-given unique roles. Women have unique God-given roles. There is no inequality between the genders, but there is also no fluidity between the genders. Second implication. Like the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, the relationship between husbands and wives is a reality of who we are, not a choice to accept or deny. By which I mean, you can't look at verse 3 and kind of pick and choose the bits you like the old kind of sweets and woolies, right? You can't go, I like verse 1, the head of every man is Christ. I like line 3, or the head of Christ is God, but I'm not having line 2. To say that is to assert, I have the right to do anything, and say that actually you are not claiming Jesus as your head. Wives, you cannot have Christ as your head, but not accept your husband as your head, in the same way that Jesus couldn't have God the Father as his head, and then refuse to pray, not my will, but yours be done. Now, verse 3 is the kind of principle. It's like a kind of classroom lesson. Verses 4 to 6 is then how that plays out in the everyday messy life of Corinth. But remember, there is an equality here, because look in verse 4. What is it that both men and women can do in the church in Corinth? Both do what? Two things. Pray and prophesy. Paul does not have an issue with women praying or prophesying in the church. The issue is with how men and women do that. Now remember the point, clothing communicates. And from verse 4, it would seem in Corinth, for a bloke to pray or prophesy with his head covered is dishonoring, and for a woman to pray or prophesy with her head uncovered is dishonoring to her husband. Now, bottom line is, I've wrestled with this week. We do not know why. There's a little clue in verse 5 where it says, it is the same as having her head shaved. Apparently in that culture, a woman would have her head shaved if she had been caught either cheating on her husband or if she was on the game in prostitution. And so having your head shaved was a sign that you had been immoral or kind of sexually promiscuous. And so a head covering was saying the opposite. A head covering for a woman in that culture communicated, I'm not sleeping in another man's bed. I am living faithfully to my husband as my head. And so in Corinth, what you put on your physical head showed whether or not you were accepting or rejecting your other head. And so by removing the head covering, a woman was shouting in church, I have the right to do anything. Now listen to this carefully. Although in their accessories, their head coverings, they may have just been rejecting something that was cultural, in their attitudes, they are rejecting something that was from the Creator. This is not just a cultural thing. This is a Creator God thing. Now, maybe their attitude was this. I have the right to do anything, so I'm chopping off my husband's head. I'm not having it. Or maybe it was a little bit more blatant and it was saying, I've got the right to do anything, so I'm going to go and sleep around with who I want to, and even if I get caught and I get shaved, I'm still going to stand up and pray and prophesy in church. And so Paul warns them. You may just be rejecting a cultural thing, But in doing so, you are rejecting the Creator's thing. The cultural covering was a symbol of the Creator's command. And so your attitude is rejecting both. Now again, remember what they're doing. They're not just sitting in church. They are actively praying or prophesying. Now we're going to get to prophecy in chapter 14, and then we'll explain what that means. But just take prayer. What is prayer? Prayer is an expression of our humility that is meant to benefit others. And yet by chucking off their head coverings, the women are not expressing their humility, but they're expressing their pride. I have the right to do anything. And they're not acting for the good of others. They are acting in a way that dishonors their husband. Which means that is not prayer, that is a power play. Which means in Corinth, that was disgraceful. Do you see the point? Now keep tracking because it's going to get clearer, hopefully. So, living with another head. From verse 7 then, we're going to go on and say, living for another's glory. Look at verse 7. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. What? Now let's keep going. Notice again, Paul's got an issue both with men and women. And we get another clue as to what was going on. In that previous section we read, it was a very negative thing, right? It was about disgrace. What will dishonor? Here, it's a more positive thing. It is about what will bring glory. Again, if you were here last week, you'll notice that Paul has just said that at the end of chapter 10. Whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. A Christian is not just someone who lives with another head. Jesus is my head. A Christian is someone who lives for another's glory. The purpose of my life as a Christian is to make much of Jesus and to put him on display. We live for the glory of another. Then Paul says, woman is the glory of man. Now I think Paul's point is this. Just as Adam on his own was not good without Eve in Eden, so too a husband is not glorious without his wife. The two go together to put God's goodness and his grace on display. A husband and a wife together can uniquely put the gospel on display. Jesus as the husband who lays down his life for the church, the wife as the bride who gives herself to follow and submit to her husband. Together, they cannot put that, on their own, they cannot put that glory on display. Together, they do. Now, what has that got to do with head coverings? Well, again, their clothing is communicating. And it's communicating here that they are both grasping at their own glory. Glory graspers. Yes, Gov? That's all right.
And the evidence that here going with man and women and stuff.
Yeah.
But in the Old Testament, you've got like the prophets, they have like more than similar amounts of wives.
Well,
where does that come in? You know what I mean?
We'll come to that later. All right? Hold that thought. And either we'll deal with it here or we'll chat at the end of the service. All right, bud? So their clothing is communicating here that they are grasping at glory. The men by covering their heads. Now apparently in idol temples in Corinth, it was quite common for blokes who would have worn togas to kind of lift up the tail of their toga, I don't know if they call it a tail, and put it over their head to kind of communicate that they were important and very spiritual. They were grasping at glory. And he seems to say that men were bringing this into the church to try and show how good they were. And so Paul says, stop it. Stop grasping at your own glory. Get your head covered off your head. The purpose of you being here is not to show how good you are, but to put God's glory on display. In terms of the women, it would seem that they were pinning their head coverings to assert their own independence in a way that glorified themselves, ignored God's creation order, and was bringing dishonor to their husbands. And so Paul says the same thing. Stop it. Stop grasping at your own glory by not covering your head, and glorify God and preserve your hubby's reputation. And so although in their accessories they were either mimicking or rejecting the culture, in their attitude they were grasping at the glory that was only due their Creator. And so Paul concludes, for the sake of the women, that they ought to have authority over their own head. In a culture where the head covering communicates that you are rejecting any authority other than your own, and communicates that you are living for no one else's glory but your own, Paul says, cover your head. Fight the peer pressure to say, I have the right to do anything, and instead humbly say, I have the responsibility to honor Jesus and honor my husband. Now, think again about where they are and what they're doing. They're in church, and they are praying and prophesying. And church is meant to be the place where this is the stage for showing how good God is. And yet both men and women seem to be stealing the stage, trying to grasp glory for themselves. Paul says, no, stop it. Which is why, by the way, I think he chucks in that line about angels. What is the obsession of angels in the Bible? Angels are either obsessed with or about protecting the glory of God. Angels are either seen like covering their eyes, basking in the glory of God, or armed to the teeth to protect the glory of God. And so angels, who are always witnessing of what goes on in the church, have a particular interest when people in the church try and steal the glory of the God of the church. So if you grasp at glory for yourself when you're in Gracemount Community Church, you piss off the angels. But if you live for God's glory in Gracemount Community Church, you make the angels sing. I think that's the point. Living with another head, living for another's glory. Third thing, verse 11 to 16, living, needing one another. Look at verse 11. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? Calvin, it's a good job you had your hair cut. But that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For long hair is given as a head covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. Now again, what? Now the point here is this. Paul is very aware of the way this could be misunderstood or misapplied. He knows men's tendency to either abuse responsibility or abandon responsibility. And he knows women's tendency to either react to that kind of cowering into insignificance or fighting for that kind of self-sufficient independence. And so Paul guards against both extremes by reminding both sexes that they need one another. They are not independent, they are interdependent. So yes, he says, Eve came from Adam. But without Eve, you can't have no Cain or Abel. Little Caleb and Tommy are reminders here of how dependent blokes are upon women. But the dependence of both sexes on one another is a reminder of how completely dependent we are upon God. Look at the phrase, everything comes from him. Now that everything includes your gender. And that everything includes the roles that God has given your gender. It also includes the very nature of things. I think what Paul is saying here is this. Woven deep into the fabric of our creation, but also deep into the convictions of our consciences, are a difference between male and female. That's what he's talking about, that kind of long hair, short hair thing. It is true that if a bloke doesn't cut his hair, it will get to be as long as a woman's. Now, does what Paul says here mean that Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Sideshow Bob, Legolas, and Calvin at some point have been a disgrace to the male race because of their long hair? I don't think that's what he's saying. But I think he is saying, in any given culture, for a man to go against nature and dress or behave like a woman in that culture, or for a woman to go against nature and behave and dress like a man in that culture is not just a challenge to the culture, but a challenge to the Creator. God made men to be men, and God made women to be women. And all this comes from God because we need it. Men need women to be women, and women need men to be men. We need each other and those God-given roles. We are living, needing one another. So, 3 things. Now we're going to see how this applies. Living for another head, living for another's glory, living, needing one another. Which for Paul concludes in Corinth like this. Blokes, take your head coverings off. Women, put a head covering on. The question is, what does that mean for Gracemount today? Would it be wrong for me to preach in a snapback? And girls, should you all have hats on? Now at this point, some good, Bible-believing, Jesus-loving, Spirit-filled, God-glorifying Christians would conclude, yes. You could go to churches in Scotland, certainly churches in Northern Ireland, churches across the world where all of the women are wearing hats. That's fine if that is the conclusion you come to. But I'm going to come to the conclusion, no. Very tempted to sing, you can leave your hat on if you're a bloke, because that's okay. Here's why I think that's right. Stick to your notes, Brett. I think the Corinthians were either rejecting or mimicking things in their culture. And so the accessories they wore on their heads are only issues because of the attitudes that lay behind them. The cultural things in Corinth were more than cultural things because they were assault on a creator thing. But the issue Paul has is not so much their apparel, but it is their attitude. See, for us, we live in a very different culture. In Gracemount, headwear is not a symbol of authority or anti-authority. In Gracemount, for a woman to have her head shaved is not a symbol of sexual disgrace. Long-haired men in Gracemount are not a disgrace. I mean, some are, but it's not a kind of cultural thing, all right? Now, however, while the accessory thing is not an issue in Gracemount, the attitude still is. And while the cultural thing is not an issue in Gracemount, the creator thing still is. See, let me ask you these questions. Is head coverings an issue in Gracemount? No. Is headship an issue in Gracemount? Yes. Is grasping at glory an issue in Gracemount? Yes. Is independence an issue in Gracemount? Yes. I think in our community, where many men have been abusive or unfaithful or have simply abandoned their partners, the product of that is many strong, determined, self-sufficient women. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing. The reason for that is massively understandable given the reality of men. However, the overreaction is dangerous. See, the danger is that those attitudes in women in our community, women in our church, can topple into the kind of defiant, overly independent, anti-authoritarian, men-hating feminism that basically makes their motto, I'm going to kill all the men. Men die. And as I say, that is understandable, given a lot of the experiences of women in our community. Now, God understands our painful past. He also understands that many men are pigs. But God also knows that His order, His design, and His purpose in this creation and for our relationships is for our good. If you look at a lot of the mess in our community, what does it come down to? Breakups between relationships between men and women. And our mess shows we need God's help. You could put it this way. Our mess shows we need His head. And so what I want to try and do is apply what we've seen in 1 Corinthians to the attitudes that are still within us. I'm just going to run through these headings again. Living with another head, living for another's glory, and living needing one another. So living with another head. Blokes, Husbands particularly, obey Jesus, your head, by living for the sake of and leading your wives. Husbands, you need to lay down your life for your wife by imitating Jesus. Which means do not be lazy, do not be abusive, do not be unfaithful, do not be absent, do not be overbearing, but love her. Read the Bible with her, pray for her, communicate with her, give up your rights for her. Again, if your headship does not look like the self-giving of Jesus, it is not Christian headship. Wives, obey Jesus, your head, by following the authority of your husband. That doesn't mean lie down and be a doormat. It means imitating Jesus by being trusting of his will for you in this. Guard your heart against power plays. Don't undermine him in public. Challenge him privately. Support him prayerfully. Communicate with him honestly. You are his glory. He needs you. Second one then, living for another's glory. Men, cut the spiritual glory grasping that frustrates your wife when you put on an act at church trying to look like something you are not in private. Don't do the equivalent of kind of covering your head like the boys in Corinth by trying to look spiritual in church when you are not loving and leading at home and in private. Your wife and your kids will know when you are bang at it. Women, wives, we need your input at Gracemount Community Church. We need you to be people who hear, pray, and prophesy. But you need to guard against the cultural peer pressure to overreact into the kind of self-promotion that sees everything you do as either scoring points for women or scoring points against men. Church is not a game of boys v girls. It is a place where we exist for the glory of God. Girls, women, let me also encourage you to be careful how you dress, particularly in church. Your clothing communicates. And especially as we get towards summer, blokes will be turned on by the slightest view of anything. And so I'd encourage you, particularly in the summer, to dress in a way that in church doesn't distract men from why we're here and doesn't cause them to stumble. Dress for your husband's eyes only. Third thing, living, needing one another. Blokes, cut the macho nonsense, all right? As Saul will tell you, real men cry. 1 Corinthians teaches that strength is actually a weakness and that weakness is actually a strength. So don't hide your vulnerability. You're not an island. You need others, which means you need to let them in. Women, wives, singles, single mums, please do not make Destiny's Child song, Independent Women, your anthem, all right? As we're going to see in chapter 12, the church is a body, which means there is no place either for saying, I don't need you, or for saying, I don't belong here. We need each other in our families, and we need each other in the church family. Final thing, on that, we will need men to be men and women to be women. We will culturally feel a pressure to relax on the Bible's views when it comes to gender, marriage, elders, and sexuality. But on these things, we must not be defined by or tossed about by our culture, but we need to be firm in the design and the word of our Creator. We need men to be men, in terms of how God defines that, and we need women to be women, in terms of how God defines that. Living with another head, living for another's glory, living needing others. Now my guess is there's going to be loads of questions on this. And so you need to come and ask me, like that one, come and ask me afterwards, and we can continue this discussion. If you're not a Christian, right, you may just be thinking, what on earth have I come to? I get that. But let me just finish by saying for you, it is true that when it comes to our relationships, this is where the breakdown happens. It comes where we have ignored God's creational design, and we have said, I have the right to do anything. And I hope you would see that that attitude within you is something that has not just caused hurt to others, it is something that has sinned against God. The truth is, you need Jesus to be your head. Not just to teach you, but actually to save you. To be the one who becomes nothing, becomes despised, becomes low, to save you. You need Jesus as your head. And if you've not done that, I would encourage you not to delay. You need to do that today. Not just take him as your Savior, but take him as your Lord. So here's what we're going to do.